I went camping in Big Sur, California with one of my best friends. It was off season and a Sunday night, so the place was practically empty. We picked a campsite about a half-mile walk to the ocean. It was in a huge open field surrounded by a lush forest. In the background were limestone mountains, and you could hear the crashing of the ocean's waves. We spent the night around a campfire telling stories and eating. We're both pretty experienced backpackers too. We are very diligent in ensuring we do not leave any trace of food by our site. I have my dog with me too. She was leashed around one of the few trees in the field on a long metal leash and full harness. It's a full moon, and it was pouring beautiful blue light across the field. It was absolutely pristine and breathtaking. Around 1 a.m., something spooks my dog. Now, she is used to the woods, but I mean, she is flipping out, tugging hard on the leash, like she is desperate to escape. She pulls so hard that her harness snaps and she goes bolting across the field into the wilderness. I lose my cool. I drop everything and bolt after her. I'm not thinking straight, running into the woods at night. My only concern was getting her, even if it meant risking my own safety. I rescue her. I find her curled up in a random clearing in the woods, looking ashamed and terrified. Thank God she ran in a straight line. Otherwise, I would have been totally lost. I walk back carrying her, and my heart is pounding furiously at the horror of the idea of her being lost in the wilderness forever. The thought now is still unbearable. I can feel her heart pounding too in my arms. She's terrified. I'm no longer in a great mood. We all head to bed in my tent, but my dog won't lay down. She refuses. Her ears are up, and she's staring intensely at the tent wall, as if she could see right through it, and she's tracking something. It takes a while for my nerves to calm down from my chase earlier. I'm working hard at deep breaths and reminding myself that I'm prepared for anything that I could encounter. That my dog is simply spooked from maybe a raccoon. Maybe she's just exhausted and acting up. Then I hear it, cackling, like a high-pitched laughter that is full of a disgusting type of joy, and it's coming from outside my tent. My senses go on high alert. My body tenses up so tightly, it's like I'm about to break in half. I can't even breathe. And then I hear more cackling, like a group of witches were doing something evil just yards away. It fills my ears, laughing and more laughing. It's loud and it just sounds so wrong. I can't even bring myself to move to look at my friend. It's like my entire body has given up. The laughs are then followed up with blood-curdling screams. It honestly sounded like somebody was being murdered. It was full of panic and horror and sadness. Dear God, it could have been wolves or coyotes killing their prey, but it sounded so distinctly human. The laughter, the sobbing, the screams. Finally, my friend says something. What the hell? I even begin to laugh a little because the situation was so intense and wild. I had no idea how else to react. I can't handle this, I say, and suggest that we bolt for the car. It's a mile away, so we decide to stay. We just listened to the laughter and screaming until it faded away. When it was over, I didn't bother going to bed. Camping with two friends, the middle of the night. All three of us inside a square tent, just chilling out, chatting. The lights are on. One side of the tent wall begins to cave inward, as if there's strong wind or something pushing on the side of the tent. Everyone freaks out, but I assume it's the wind. Chill out, guys. I proceed to jump up and punch the tent wall, but then I connect with something. A feeling of punching flesh is unmistakable. Now I freak out. What or who did I just punch through the tent wall? I eventually convince my friends it's the smartest idea to have a look outside the tent, but it's been 15 minutes, and by the time they agree, there's nothing out there. I was in my tent, and it was the middle of the night, perhaps 1 a.m., and I had woken up to go pee just like normal. I was about to unzip the tent when I heard a small scratching sound. I paused. It was a slow, deliberate, crunchy, digging sound. It was too rhythmic for an animal. So after making sure it wasn't my dad who was sharing the tent, I unzipped a corner of the door and peeked out. The moon was just bright enough for me to see a woman squatting right next to our little two-man tent, digging at the ground with her bare hands. My dad went and shined a flashlight on her and told her to go back to wherever she had made camp. The woman got up silently, leaving a 4-inch deep hole next to the tent, and started walking away. I went outside, went pee, and got back into my sleeping bag. A few minutes later, I was awoken again by a clattering sound of a person or an animal walking around where we had put our stuff. I looked outside again, and the woman was crouched low, walking around our stuff and looking at things the way a monkey would. My father stepped out of the tent, shined the flashlight on her again, and she faced him. He asked her to kindly leave our stuff alone, but she just stood there, dirty, but clearly not malnourished, staring at his light. He gave up and went back to the tent. Soon, we heard her digging again at her little hole, which was literally 6 inches and 2 pieces of thin nylon away from my head. I shouted for her to go away, and she ran away in an animalistic fashion and didn't return. I fell back asleep, and in the morning, our stuff was scattered, but nothing was missing. My husband and I were out of town on vacation. We were staying at this bed and breakfast in Vermont. It was in a pretty rural area, but very beautiful. The place appeared to be very old, with elderly folks managing it. They were so nice and pleasant. We arrived there about 7 o'clock and were starving. The old man that showed us to our honeymoon suite room told us he would make us some supper. We told him he didn't have to, but we didn't fight him too much, since he genuinely seemed like he wanted to, and we really were starving. He made us some red potatoes and chicken fried steak with toast. After eating, we sat with him and his wife and talked. We asked questions about the place and how long they had worked there. They told us they owned the joint. They asked us where we were coming from and what the occasion was. They were so nice. In the middle of our conversation, we noticed a man exit the bathroom down the hall, which was visible from the side of the table we were sitting at, and stomp a few doors down to his room, or what I assumed it was. He seemed troubled, like he was upset, or maybe on drugs. He was making grunting noises. The elderly couple just smiled, and you could tell they felt very uncomfortable, like they were familiar with this man and were just dealing with him. I wanted to ask about him, but I didn't. I felt like I'd be making it worse and making them more uncomfortable. Later that night, my husband and I were in our room, laying in bed talking, when in the room next to ours, we heard a very faint voice say, "Not again." It sounded like a man to me, but my husband said to him it sounded like a woman's voice. Then we heard what sounded like a big piece of furniture being moved around the room. A few hours passed, and we were asleep, when I was shaken awake by my husband. I was startled, and he said he heard somebody gasp in the room next door, and make a noise that sounded like they were in some kind of trouble. He said it was not the room that we heard the noise earlier, but the other side of our room. I told him he should call the front desk, or the living room, and tell whoever would be working there. He did, but very strangely, nobody picked up the phone. He put some clothes on and went down to the front of the building, where we met the elderly couple from before. He was gone for about 10 minutes, and then returned and said nobody was down there. He said he walked into the back kitchen, around the outside of the house, and never saw anyone. I'd say about 20 minutes after he returned to our room, we heard somebody walking in the hallway. They eventually walked up to our room, and then stopped. Thankfully, the door was locked, because whoever it was tried opening it. My husband yelled out, "Occupied!" in a stern, annoyed voice. The person at the door then continued walking towards the staircase. We eventually went back to sleep and woke up at around 9 a.m. We packed up our stuff and went down to the front expecting to see the elderly couple, but what we found instead was very troubling. We walked into the back kitchen once again, and laying in the sink were white rags that looked like they had blood on them. We continued to look around, and eventually my husband opened a closet and found a mop bucket, and inside the bucket was very thick-looking red water. At that point, I freaked out. I knew something was very wrong. We walked around the whole place and never saw anyone again. Eventually, we left some money on the back kitchen counter and a note, and left. The rest of our vacation was normal, I guess you could say, but when we hit our next stop, we called the police and told them that they should check out that bed and breakfast. They told us they would, but we never got a call back. We never found out what happened until we got home. A few days after we arrived at our house, police were at our door questioning us about our stay at that bed and breakfast. We were told that the elderly couple were brutally murdered and their bodies were dismembered. The woman was found in the room next to ours, chopped up, and her husband was found in the room on the other side. His body had been dragged to the bathroom, and his body had been cut up in the bathtub. I was sick upon hearing this. We had to go take a polygraph test, but our story and willingness to cooperate excluded us from possible suspects. Months passed, and I would often inquire about it and call the police, asking if they had found who did it. Eventually, they had. We learned that the man that was staying at the place, the one that walked out of the bathroom that night, had committed the crimes. We haven't gone on vacation since. My childhood was filled with terrible and horrifying incidents, one of which takes the cake. My parents split up when I was very young, and I lived with my father. We lived in the middle of nowhere, except there were a few people that lived on our street. The street was really long and lonely. We lived towards the end of the street, and in the middle of the street was a woman. I thought she was really weird. She lived in a trailer, and once, when I walked by, she tried to sell me some candy. I was with a neighbor boy, so I didn't feel scared or anything. I told her I didn't have any money for it, and she laughed when I told her that. Like I said, she was really weird. What's even weirder is that my father started dating this woman sometime after we moved in. She never came to our house, but occasionally my father would go to hers. So living on this street was weird in itself. It seemed like weird or bad things would constantly happen. Unusual people would drive down the road and throw parties where they would light a tree on fire with gasoline. It really seemed like everyone living on this street was really weird, except me and my father. I always wondered what my father saw in that weird woman that lived down the street, but was too young to really put it together. One night, shit at my house became a horror movie. I was in my room playing with God knows what when my bedroom light turned off. I got up and opened my door. My bedroom was on the second floor, and I called out for my father. He didn't respond to me. I was confused because we had just eaten dinner together not an hour earlier in the dining room downstairs. I called out again, but heard nothing in return. I went downstairs and outside and saw a police car drive by and stop at our neighbor's house. I stood on the porch and just watched when my father suddenly surprised me from behind. He told me we needed to go inside. When we got back in the house, my father was frantic and telling me we need to hide, that somebody hurt his girlfriend, the weird woman I was talking about, and was coming down the street towards our house. This scared me, and I of course agreed to hide. We went upstairs and into the spare room next to mine. It was dark outside, and all the lights were out. I told him they went out, but he seemed to ignore me. He tried to turn the light on, but it didn't work. He sweared, and then he told me to get down on the ground. He told me he could hear somebody coming up our stairs. I started to tear up and was very frightened now. He told me then that he was going to go confront the person in our house, and he wanted me to stay put. I asked him to stay over and over again, but he insisted. Leaving me crying on the floor, he got up and walked out of the room. It felt like an eternity passed, and I heard nothing. Then, I heard something. I heard the floorboards by my bedroom door creak, as if somebody was standing there. I froze up, terrified. I was too scared to even call for my father, which I desperately wanted to do. Then, I heard the person run down the hall and down the stairs. I remembered that our old house was built in such a way that you could walk around the roof of the second story and enter the bedrooms through the windows. I turned and looked outside and saw only darkness. I decided to open the window and climb out. I moved around the window where I was out of sight and sat there in the dark for a time. After waiting for a few minutes, I finally made the choice to jump down to the first story roof and then jump down again to the ground. I did, but I hurt my ankle in the process. I sat right where I landed, rubbing my ankle, and the scariest thing that has ever happened, somebody standing about 5 feet away started walking in my direction. I looked up to see a figure in the darkness standing there, obviously looking at me. They didn't move. I did, however. I got up and ran up the driveway to the street and over to my neighbor's house. There was a bunch of stuff going on. People were walking around, panicked. The police had come and asked everyone questions, and they told me they had come to our house too, but nobody answered the door. I asked my neighbor to take me to my house to get my father, but they just said no every time I asked. Very late that night, the police came again and dropped a bombshell on me and my neighbor. My father was found in the back pasture and was arrested for murder. He had killed his girlfriend, that weird woman down the street, and was trying to pretend like somebody else was in our house. He was sentenced to 12 to 20 years for second-degree murder, and I've kept in contact with him. I've asked him many times why he left the room I was in that night, why he ran around the house trying to scare me and pretended to be someone else, and he would just always say he didn't know. I was camping in Lake Tahoe as a teenager. The usual trip my family took. We would hike, and usually my dad would take the boat up to the lake. This one particular trip, we had heard from a park employee that a little boy had gone missing. Everyone was looking for him. Myself, my brother, and my dad all went to look as well. We looked for a few hours, but didn't find him or any trace of him. We left the next day, and we didn't find out if the boy was found or not. The very next year we went back to the same place, and on our first day camping, we went for a hike. On the trail, I walked out into the trees to go pee. That's when I saw a little blue shirt a few feet away hanging on a tree branch. It didn't click with me at first, but when it did, I returned to the trail and told my dad. He went out and looked, and when we got back to our camper, he drove off in his truck to go tell someone. When my dad returned, he said that he was told that the boy that went missing was wearing a blue polo shirt. This sent chills down my spine. The next day, we went on the same trail, and I went back to where I found the shirt. It was gone. The one and only time I ever went camping with my boyfriend, something crazy happened. It was a popular campsite, and there were many people there when we were. It was in the middle of summer. At some point, we decided to go skinny dipping in the river that wasn't too far after the sun went down. We walked down to the river, and as we expected, nobody was there. While we were messing around in the water, and again, let me remind you, we were not wearing anything, a man appears out of nowhere and is standing in the sand looking at us. I was terrified because the creepy man just stood there. My boyfriend asked him if everything was okay, and I could hear in his voice that he was scared. The man ignored his question and then started walking into the water towards us. I can't tell you what this was like to where you would understand. It was ridiculous, right out of a scary movie. We both started swimming across the river to the other side. We didn't want this creep to get to us. We made it to the other side and saw that he was very close. Naked, not caring, we ran into the trees and up to the campsite on the other side of the river. Luckily, it was very dark and nobody saw us. We ran into a bathroom that was connected to the campsite and just stood there, shivering and asking ourselves if this shit was actually happening. Eventually, we went back to the river and saw that the man was gone. We swam back across. We reached the other side and saw that our clothes and phones were gone. We went back up to the path to our tent and lucked out again. Nobody ever saw us, except that creep. We got dressed and drove up to the office to explain that somebody stole our stuff, but we had to lie and say that it happened during the day because obviously skinny dipping was not allowed. We never saw the clothes or our phones again. What the hell was that guy doing, walking into the river towards us? Your guess is as good as mine.
I am a United States Postal Service carrier. Something very weird and creepy happened to me a few weeks ago on my route. I've been carrying mail for 4 years now, and have had this route for about 2 years. It's a decent area to deliver mail, and I've never really had a problem with it, compared to other bad areas around my city that I unfortunately have had to deliver in. Some carriers have to deliver in shady neighborhoods every single day, so I do feel I got lucky with mine. I always go to this one specific park in the middle of my route to eat lunch every day. There's never really too many people there when I am, but this day, there were 2 little girls playing on the playground. This park was a pretty good size, and the playground was surrounded by pathways, beautiful flowers, and even a few fountains. The 2 girls showed up to the playground after I sat down at the picnic area about 20 minutes before. They were doing their thing, and I was texting my girlfriend and watching videos on my phone, when out of nowhere this guy comes up behind me and says in a stern voice, "You better get out of here, or I will call the police, you damn pervert." I was shocked and literally speechless. I spun around to look at him, and he was huge, probably around 300 pounds, balding and wearing old-looking glasses. I couldn't think of what to say before he spoke again. He said, "Get out of here, or I will beat the hell out of you." My face turning red with fear, I finally replied, "I'm just eating my lunch, man. I'm not sure what the problem is." The man huffed at me and turned around and started walking away down the path. I sat there in awe for a few seconds, and then looked at my phone to check the time. I had 5 minutes left of lunch. I texted my girlfriend about the huge guy, and then I looked over to the playground. I saw the two girls standing on the top of a big wooden slide, and I saw the man standing below them. He was talking to them. My first thought was that he was their parent or something, and got pissed and paranoid when he saw me eating lunch. But then I saw him reach up and try to grab one of the girl's ankles. The girl let out a brief scream, and I stood up. The man turned in all directions, looking for people who might have seen it. Well, he must have forgotten that I was there, or maybe he assumed I was still facing the other way eating. I have no idea. I started walking over to them after seeing that. I got close, and I could see the girls looked terrified. I shouted over to them, "Hey, do you guys know this man?" The man turned around and had a very scared but angry look on his face. The girls both said in unison, "No." The man started walking away immediately after that, and I just stood there and watched. After he walked out of the front gate of the park, I asked the girls if they had a phone and could call somebody to come get them. One of the girls did, and called somebody. I'm not sure who. I waited there until I saw an older woman enter the park. She walked over to us and asked what was happening. I told her everything, and she didn't really react like I thought she would. She seemed annoyed or something, actually, like annoyed at the girls. She told them to get down and that they were leaving. After the three of them left the park, I checked my phone again and I was 35 minutes behind schedule. So I quickly walked out of the park and turned to go down the sidewalk towards my truck. I got to my truck, unlocked it, and got inside. I started the engine and started driving. A few blocks down that same street, I saw the man sitting in a small red car. He was glaring at me as I drove by. I immediately got my phone out and called my boss. I told him everything I saw, and he said he would call the cops. The rest of my shift I thought about that guy, and I felt bad for leaving. When I got back to the office, my boss told me he did call the police, and that they went over to the park. I really hope he did, and that they caught that guy. I haven't seen him or the girls there since. I am in my 30s now, but when I was 11 years old, I had a frightening experience with a mailman. I was at the kitchen table with my mom, and we were making cookies and brownies. We were mixing things, and my mom said that she didn't have enough eggs for what we were making. She washed her hands and told me she was going to run to the store, and she'd be right back. I stayed there at the table, sitting in the wooden chair, watching the TV that was on in the living room next to me. I'm not sure how long after my mom had left, the mailman appeared at the kitchen door and tried opening it without saying a word. Thankfully, it was locked, and he spoke to me. "Hey, can you unlock the door? I need to bring a package inside." I felt sick to my stomach. This mailman was a big guy, and he looked really creepy. I told him he could just leave it on the porch, and he said back to me, No, I can't leave this package. It has expensive things inside. Just open up, and I'll be on my way." I didn't know what to say, and right after that my brother had walked into the living room after coming down the stairs, and walked across the room and into the kitchen with me. He stopped by the bowl of brownie mix and dipped his finger in, and said, "Where's Mom?" I looked past him to the kitchen door, and the man was gone. I got up and looked out the door. He didn't leave the box he was carrying. My brother thought nothing at all of this, but my mom was a little weirded out when she got home. I saw our mailman a couple days later, and it wasn't the same guy. Something I never realized at the time, but did when I got older, is how would the mailman know that there was expensive things inside our package? What would have happened if I had opened the door. Let me start off by saying I am female, and I am not a typical mail carrier. I was hired to deliver mail in the rural areas of a town I live close to. I don't walk door to door like most mail carriers you see. I usually just drive to each mailbox out here in the country, although every once in a while, I do have to leave my truck and carry mail to someone's door, usually because their mailbox has overgrown weeds surrounding it. The mailbox is rusted shut, or in some cases, they simply don't have one. Something creepy happened on my third day. I had parked my truck and started walking a long driveway to deliver the mail to a house. Their mailbox was completely surrounded by weeds and spider webs. It was raining and I couldn't see very well because of my glasses. As I walked, I suddenly tripped on something and landed in a puddle. I couldn't believe I just did that, and I was soaked. I scrambled to my feet and looked around for what I tripped on. I didn't see anything. I was confused and pissed off. I bent down to pick up the mail I dropped, which was also now soaked. After gathering all of it, I started to jog over to the front door. I rang the doorbell and left the mail in front of the door. I turned around and started heading back down the long driveway. I was jogging, trying to get to my warm truck as fast as I could. As I got closer, I saw a man standing by the front of my truck, and when he saw that I noticed him, he ducked behind it, almost like a child would that was trying to hide from an adult. Right after that, I heard a noise behind me. I turned to look, and there was now 2 men standing on the porch watching me, the mail still sitting at their feet. The way they were just standing there, watching me leave, was so creepy for some reason. I made it to my truck and walked around it. The man that was there was not there anymore. I didn't feel safe. I got inside my truck and locked the door. I drove away and was freezing cold for the rest of the day due to falling in that stupid puddle. The next day, I pulled up to the same house. It wasn't raining this day, and I could see clearly as I began to walk the driveway. I stopped suddenly when I noticed a long, thin wire stretching across the driveway, right before the large puddle I had fell in the day before. I could not believe my eyes, and then I noticed a person crouched down behind the bushes next to the puddle. I immediately turned and started walking back to my truck. When I got there, I got inside and locked the door again and started to drive away. As I did this, I looked up the driveway and saw the man standing up now next to the puddle, and the same 2 men standing on the front porch. I had an argument with my boss later about switching routes permanently, as I didn't want to be close to that house ever again. He finally agreed, and I never did go there again, nor did I hear about anyone else ever having trouble delivering mail to that house. When I was in 8th grade, my parents separated. Basically, my mom packed her and I up one night, and we moved into my grandpa's and didn't look back. We ended up living there through my high school years. When he died, my parents officially got divorced. My mom remarried, and we moved into the city with my stepfather. My grandpa lived on the first floor of the apartment, and the owners, an elderly couple who were family to us through marriage, lived on the 2nd floor. The property also had a small in-law cottage out in the back where my uncle lived. For some reason that I will never understand, there was no lock to get into the actual building if you entered through the back. The back door opened into a landing where there was a locked and deadbolted door to our apartment, and then 2 sets of stairs. One led up to the also locked and deadbolted door of the 2nd floor apartment, and the other led down to the basement where there was also no lock. Our apartment could also be entered from the front of the building, but in order to access the 2nd floor apartment or the basement, you had to go through this landing. The basement was actually pretty nice, and at one point they had started to convert it into its own apartment,
before they ultimately decided to make the in-law cottage instead. So in the basement, there was a full kitchen complete with an oven, a sink, and a refrigerator. The washer and dryer, which was shared by all of us, was also in the basement, as well as just some general storage stuff. The basement was entirely open except for a back room that was full of storage. It had one of those kind of swinging saloon type doors where you can see above and beneath them. The storage area was longer than it was deep, so you couldn't really see anything much behind the doors aside from shelves. You had to walk in them and turn to really see the room. One night when I was in high school, I think I was 15 at the time, after taking a shower, I saw that the laundry bin in the bathroom was pretty full, so I grabbed a ton of laundry and headed down towards the basement. It was pretty late at night, but I figured I would at least get it started and move some things over in the morning. I tossed everything onto the ground and started sorting out colors when I got hit with a horrible feeling in my gut. The basement was not at all a creepy basement. It was well lit and pretty welcoming with the kitchen and everything, but for some reason that I can't explain, something just started to feel wrong. Anyone who has ever been hit with the feeling that they were being watched knows exactly what I'm talking about. I don't know how or why it came over me, but it was something that I couldn't shake, and I found myself looking over the saloon doors and the only part of the basement that I couldn't see in its entirety. I don't know why, maybe just to assure myself I was being a big baby, I started to walk towards the back room, but stopped myself just as I reached out towards the swinging doors. I've been a horror fan for as long as I can remember, and had seen more horror movies than I could count, and I knew that if that was a movie, I would be calling myself a dumbass and saying not to go into that back room. I quickly snapped my hand back and ran up the stairs, leaving all the clothes behind, and into our apartment, where I locked the doors and immediately told my mom that I just had the worst feeling in the basement and that I was super creeped out. Despite me not being the type of person that scares easily, she basically rolled her eyes at me and told me to go to bed. I ended up doing as I was told, though it took me a bit to shake the feeling and finally fall asleep. Later that night, my bladder woke me up and I stumbled out of my room to go to the bathroom. I didn't turn any of the lights on as I started making my way towards the bathroom because it usually woke up my grandpa and I didn't want to bother him. When I got closer to the bathroom, I noticed my mom standing in the doorway of her bedroom, and something looked off, and it took me a moment to realize that she was clutching the phone. She then noticed me and whispered to me to get against the wall, which I did without hesitation. It took a few moments for the grogginess to wear off and my eyes to adjust to the darkness before I could see what she did. My mom's bedroom was immediately off of the kitchen. The kitchen was where the back door that led to the landing and the basement was located. The door had a tiny window up top with a small but thick curtain. It was thin enough that you could see that someone was outside of the door, but thick enough to not be able to make out any of the features of the person on the other side. But there was someone on the other side of the door, and every now and then the doorknob would move and you could hear this scratching sound was on the other side. I have never been so afraid in my entire life. I'm not sure how I managed to do what I did next. It was like someone else had taken control over me entirely. I slid down against the wall that I was clinging to and started to crawl against it in the darkness towards the kitchen. My mom looked petrified, watching back and forth between me and the back door. She kept whispering for me to stop and go back, but I kept moving forward, low and against the wall, towards the counter where I carefully grabbed a butcher knife. I was shaking the whole time I moved, with a knife in my hand on the ground next to the fridge, which was next to the door the man was trying to get into. I had this horrible feeling that I was going to be killed, but if I wasn't going to go down without a fight. It felt like I sat there forever in the darkness, next to the door with my mom hiding in the bedroom doorway across from me, just waiting. But it was only for a few minutes. My mom had already called 911 before I had woken up and stumbled my way towards the bathroom. The lights from approaching squad cars soon filled the kitchen, and from the other side of the door, I could hear a sudden clamoring and commotion and the slam of the back screen bursting open as the would-be assailant took off running. It was around 3 a.m. when this happened, so it was completely dark outside, and we lived right by some train tracks and very thick bushes and trees that made it easy for the man to escape the cop that pursued him. The police came in and took statements from my mom and I. My grandpa, who was partially deaf, had managed to sleep through almost the entire thing until the police came through to search the apartment and make sure that we were okay. The outside of the door and the doorknob were both covered in deep scratches, like someone had been going at it with a knife, trying to figure out how to get in. But that wasn't the most horrifying part to me. That was reserved for the basement. The clothes that I had brought down were not where I had left them, and they had been thrown about and disheveled, and the back room, the one with the swinging door that I had stopped myself from going in, the boxes that were out of view had also been thrown about, all opened, obviously gone through, with some things missing, and there were some wrappers from food on the floor. He had been down there looking for something to steal. He was down there when I went down to do laundry. I had almost walked into that room, and based on what we had seen on the door, he had a knife. To this day, I can't help but find myself sometimes thinking about what would have happened if I had walked into that room. My family used to drive to Tahoe around Christmas time when I was a kid. We would stay in this group of cabins that you could rent out for a weekend and go skiing and hiking. One year, I was walking through the forest with my sisters and my cousins, and we went much farther than we had ever gone, miles out into the wilderness. We never saw any animals, but eventually we came across a small shack, completely in the middle of nowhere, far into the deep woods. It was the creepiest thing we had ever seen, and we dared each other to go knock on the door, thinking that someone might be inside. This shack was no bigger than a porta-potty. I built up some courage, and two of my cousins and myself walked up to it. We knocked lightly on the door and then tried opening it. It was locked, and we could see that the doorknob had a hole for a key. And just before we were about to leave, I saw something on a tree about 10 feet away from it. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was a thumb nailed to the tree. We ran and never looked back. I was walking around the woods with some friends years ago when we nearly stumbled into a pit full of rattlesnakes. Obviously, we were mortified, but the scariest part of this was that we saw a small leg of some animal sticking out of the snakes. They all swirled together, and whatever the leg had belonged to was very dead. It was the most sickening, creepy thing I have ever seen. Just the thought of falling into a pit of snakes. Oh my God. I was exploring a group of abandoned trailers out in the middle of nowhere with my friend a long time ago. The first few trailers contained nothing of interest, but in one of the trailers, we found a bed in the back. The bed was completely covered in blood. The stench that filled the room is beyond anything you could imagine. The blood was old, and it literally covered the whole bed. I caught a very quick glimpse of some old mason jars lined up on the top of the headboard, but I didn't have time to focus on what was inside them. We both immediately gagged and threw up outside. Someone was definitely murdered in that trailer. Just down the road from me, I found a brick, ranch-style home. The lawn is quite large, and the land behind the lawn is cleared, except for strategically placed trees. There are close to 20 trees on this lot. There are about 10 dog houses placed under the trees. There are water bowls for the dogs, and there are, of course, the dogs. Except these dogs are not alive. They are large, stuffed animal dogs from a toy shop. The grass is cut and the lawn is well manicured. Months go by and seasons change. It rains and turns from summer to winter, and I can see from the road that those stuffed dogs stay out there getting weathered and eventually degrading. When the stuffed dogs become too worn, they are replaced by new stuffed animal dogs. I don't want to know why someone would do this. When I was 11, my brother and I asked our mother if we could go swimming down at the pool in our apartment complex. She hesitantly said that we could, and that she wanted us back home in 45 minutes. She gave us the key to access the pool area, and when we got there, we both ran and jumped in. We splashed around and wrestled in the shallow end, and then we saw that there was a woman sitting in the spa. The spa was on the other side of the pool, and we couldn't make out the woman very well. We could only tell that she was elderly. Then my brother noticed something else. He said that the water she was sitting in looked brown. I wasn't wearing my glasses and I couldn't see that far. My brother climbed out of the pool next to me, and as he looked over at the woman from where he was standing, I saw his face turn white. He started to cry as he tried to speak to me. I got out of the pool and stood next to him. The woman was staring in our direction, and the spa was a dark, dark red. We had to walk by her to exit the pool area, and didn't even notice her when we ran inside. We walked down the side of the pool, and it seemed like the woman was watching us as we walked. As we got closer, we saw that she wasn't watching us. She was dead, and the spa water was dark red from her blood. We ran home and told our mother, and she in turn called the police. The old woman had slit her wrists. When I was a kid, I found an abandoned elementary school in the middle of the woods. I found it when I was around 10 years old while exploring at my dad's hunting club in the backwoods of Alabama. The odd thing about it was that it didn't seem to have a road leading to it, or even a place to park cars, but everything inside was from the 60s and the 70s. It also seemed to be abandoned quickly. Books were still opened on the desks, shoes still in the cubbies, and papers still scattered around the rooms. I actually took a lot of the books that weren't weather damaged and brought them home with me. I remember asking my dad about it a few years later, and he knew about it, but said it gave him the creeps, so he never went near it. My dad left that hunting club a year later, so I never had the chance to check it out a second time. On a 41-foot sailboat in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, with about 7 other men doing a shakedown test cruise, planned to be out for about 12 hours. Mid-1980s, not as reliable weather prediction resources. We get caught in a tropical storm, winds gusting into the 50-mile-per-hour range. Just this short of a weak hurricane. We had just barely rigged storm hawsers and storm sails because the one fellow on board, who was the best sailor, sensed the storm was almost on us. Otherwise, we would have died. During the storm itself, I expected to die at any time. In fact, we made a securite call on the radio. If you have time at sea, you know what I'm talking about. If not, it's not that important. For what seemed like 15 minutes, we were in a maelstrom, no visibility, but then it passed. We would live. This was about 3 p.m., and although there was cloud cover of course, the ambient light was such that you could see 2 miles or so in any direction. If you're familiar with the sea, you know that such storms, particularly in shallower depths near land masses, dredge a lot of things of the sea floor. The siding. We're all on deck, working lines, checking damage, etc., and the bay around us is choppy and churning and foaming. Old-timey sailors often use the saying, "The sea is confused." I look about 15 feet off the starboard side, and something swims to the surface, breaks the surface, looks at us, then submerges again. It was like a thin man with humanoid shape, arms articulated like a man, a human head, but its skin was covered in scales like a snake. It looked at us, blinked its weird, heavy-lidded eyes, then dove back under. So maybe you need to know a few things about me at the moment. No drugs, no alcohol, no injuries. I was elated because I was glad to be alive, but my senses in that situation were sharpened, not dulled. I had, at the time, about 6 years' experience on ships and fishing boats, and had seen squid, octopi, flying fish, sharks, skates, etc., all around the world. I was not the type of guy to see a patch of seaweed and call it a sea monster. I made an instant decision that I was not going to say anything. What could I say? I just saw a strange creature. Take my word for it. The men on this boat were all mechanics and engineers and professionals. Why get a reputation as a flake? At the time, it was important for each of us to get D, skipper, or OOD qualifications, and saying something like that would be frowned upon. And as I stood there in my life vest, soaking wet, hooked onto the steel lifeline, glad to be alive, one of the other sailors, a USN captain with over 30 years' experience in the surface navy, piped up and said, "I just saw a brown thing pop up on the surface. It looked like a lizard man with a scaly face. It blinked at us with these big eyes and then went back under." "Yeah, I saw it too," I said. No one else said that they had seen it. Then we sailed back to the pier later that day and didn't speak of it again. One night, I was hanging out with my aunt and uncle when they randomly asked me if I believe in Bigfoot. I said, "I do not, but I had an experience I certainly can't explain away." My buddy and I were passing through rural McKean County, Pennsylvania, in the Appalachian foothills after spending time in my family's hunting cabin in neighboring Potter County. I was telling my buddy about McKean County's main tourist draw, the Kinzua Bridge, once the world's tallest railroad bridge. Sadly, a few years ago the bridge was felled in the middle of the night by a tornado, ripping apart its midsection and leaving only the portions of the bridge anchored into the hillside standing. On the valley floor are rusted, contorted steel beams, some reaching dozens of feet into the air. Even though it was fast approaching midnight, my friend wanted to do some good old-fashioned trespassing to check it out. So did I. It being late at night and in the middle of nowhere, there wasn't a soul around. We hopped over their laughable security apparatus, a rented chain-link fence that wouldn't deter an 8-year-old. It's close to a full moon, and we're now 100 feet or so above the valley floor on what's left of the former monolith. We're doing the stupid, teenage, young 20s bullshit us guys do. Leaning over the edge where there used to be hundreds more feet of tracks, spitting off the edge, pissing off the edge. You know, all the prerequisites. After we grew bored of that, we began to rip off chunks of railroad ties. It was scary how easy it was to do this to something that had very recently had trains running on it. Naturally, the only course of action was to throw these huge chunks of wood off the bridge and make some noise. We chucked the chunks, and when it hit the ground, it made some noise. But oh my Lord God Jesus, the sound, the scream that came right after that will forever stick out in my mind. Outside of it being incredibly loud and urine-inducing, the best I can do is tell ya, it sounded half primate and half industrial machinery, like metal screeching while hydraulics hiss. Then, whatever it is we spooked or pissed off starts sprinting away through the forest below. Mind you, it was a full moon, and at that hour we had good illumination. We could see sizable trees bending at absurd angles by something with an insane amount of size and strength. Even its footsteps made a ruckus among its primates like grunts. Sadly, we weren't lucky enough to catch a glimpse of the beast through the dense forest canopy. Listen, I've seen a handful of black bear running in the wild. None of them made anywhere near that much noise while sprinting away. I was fortunate enough to visit South Africa once and saw a rhino sprinting through the safari just a few feet away from our jeep. Again I say, a rhino sprinting didn't even come remotely close to making that much noise. Nothing compares. Whatever it was has to be colossal. When I got back to my home in central Ohio, I scoured the net for recording of bear and mountain lion calls. Nope, nothing sounded remotely like the scream we heard. I have yet to hear anything like it on the dozens of animal documentaries I've watched, or handful of remote camping trips. Once I concluded my story, my aunt and uncle jaws were on the floor. I asked them what was up. As it turns out, there was some Bigfoot show on at the time, and they had just seen an episode that took place at the Kinzua Bridge. I didn't even know about the show's existence, and had never seen or heard of the episode. Neither had my buddy. So again, I don't believe in Bigfoot. No authenticated print, droppings, or animal carcass. The odds of something of that alleged size not leaving a conclusive trace of evidence has to be next to impossible. Is it more likely my friend and I shared in a delusion? I guess that's more likely, but we were not tried, impaired, or scared until we heard that thing. In closing, everything I said is 100% what we experienced, and true. I'll never forget it. I want a rational explanation, but almost 10 years later, I've found absolutely nothing. Last summer, I heard about them. The black-eyed children were my favorite ghost story, and quite honestly, until last night, I thought that's exactly what they were. Most of the stories I've read take place in remote towns across the Midwest region of America. I live on the east coast of America, so I figured I was safe from the phenomena happening to me. Most of the stories, for those that don't know, involve two children, usually an older girl and a little boy looking for help to get home. Sometimes the stories happen at night, sometimes early morning just before sunrise. My event happened at 1:04 a.m. Sunday, June 1st. I had been watching a science fiction double feature at my neighbor's house. It was me, and let's call them Zeke and Harry. His house is exactly a quarter-mile away, so I had walked over expecting to have some drinks and watch the movies. All in all, it was a successful night up to that point. After the movie ended, Zeke kicked Harry and I out, saying that he had a Tinder date in the morning and needed to rest. Harry and I left and started walking home together. Harry's house was in the middle of Zeke and my house. He offered me a cigarette, and I turned him down as we chatted about some of our respective year away at university. He offered me a ride home the rest of the way, but it was a decent night, so I turned him down. What was I thinking? As I got to the end of the street to the T intersection, I turned right to get to my house. I noticed a weird vibration in the air. It was making my fillings resonate in my mouth. It was pretty unpleasant, and that's when I saw the first pair. Coming out from behind the house directly ahead of me were two pale children. Goosebumps shot up my spine. At this point it was 1 a.m. and I was a little creeped out, so I decided to jog the rest of the way home. The closer I got to my house, the more children I saw. They were fucking everywhere, hundreds of them coming from every direction, all with strange black eyes. All of them were crying out for help. Help us, help us, help us. I ran as hard as I could to make it home. All the children were converging on me as I ran, and I had to dodge a couple of them from touching me. I struggled with my keys as I got to the door, and I could feel a small hand brushing the cloth of my shirt. As I ran inside and slammed the door behind me, I expected my parents and brother to come out and see what the commotion was, but no one did. I ran upstairs to wake them, but couldn't find anyone. I ran to my room, which was in the basement, glancing back outside to see a horde of children just standing staring at my house. Once I got to my room, I tried using my phone and laptop, but neither could connect to any network or got any sort of signal. I sat with my favorite knife, and I guess at some point, I fell asleep. I was awoken by my dad, who needed some help with yard work. He says he was asleep in bed with my mom all night and has told me several times to stop making up stories. I fear for tonight. When I was younger, each summer and almost every New Year, my family would pack the car and go on a road trip to visit family in Mexico. We never had any problems until one particular trip when I was 8. Like every road trip before, we left our home in North Texas around 6 p.m. in order to reach our destination the next morning. So around 2 a.m., we crossed into Mexico, and that's when things got weird. When you're on the only stretch of freeway in the middle of the desert, you don't tend to freak out about having the same car behind you for miles. It was practically pitch black outside, the only visible shapes being the dotted stars and the eerie silhouettes of the cacti. We'd been in Mexico for about an hour and still had a few more to drive, and I remember sleeping but still being semi-conscious of what was around me because I didn't have the skill to really fall asleep in a car. So when my mother suddenly spoke my dad's name, I heard her. "Miguel, that car behind us. It's been behind us since we left Laredo." My dad peeked at the car. It shrugged off my mother's tension. "A lot of cars use this road. He's probably going to Reynosa or another city." And he left it at that. Despite his sureness, my mom kept a wary eye on the car behind us. By this time, my siblings and I were hyper aware of the car and entertained ourselves with watching the car through the gaps in the luggage that blocked the rear window. We got tired pretty quick. "He's getting closer," my mother noted, and we turned to watch as the car inched closer and closer to ours. "He's too close, Miguel." And she was right. By this time, the car was practically pressed against the rear of our car, and on a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere with another few hours until daylight. It was downright scary. We couldn't do much. My dad didn't slow down, and he didn't speed away either. He just drove, and the car followed. The next 30 minutes were the most tense we had ever experienced. The car would ease off sometimes, only to press its blinding headlights against our rear once more, like he knew he was freaking us out, and enjoying it. It was during one of the periods that the car had pulled away that my mom spotted a police car up ahead, parked on the side of the road, and she didn't miss a beat. "Pull over right now, Miguel." And he did, and the car kept driving. I wonder how confused the policeman must have been as he watched my dad park our car right in front of him. The policeman came over and asked what was wrong, and my mother urgently told him everything. The car, the way it followed us, and taunted us. The policeman took her claims seriously and told us of how people were victimized and had their cars stolen on these empty highways by thugs and criminals. And then he offered to drive behind us for a while to make us feel safe. We drove off with the police cruiser behind us, relieved, until about 10 minutes later, when we saw something that confirmed the policeman's words and my mother's worst fears. 10 minutes later, we saw the car pulled over on the side of the road, waiting. This happened to me about 2 years ago, when I was on a cross-country road trip with my good friend Kim. We started in the Northwest, and our final destination was in Georgia. We were trying to make this trip as quickly as possible, and since it was just the two of us, we took shifts, sleeping and driving. We had just passed through Laramie, Wyoming, where I got pulled over for speeding. Not much, only 10 miles over the speed limit. I apologized to the police officer, and he kindly let us off the hook since our car had no cruise control and we had a long way to go ahead. After leaving Laramie, we didn't stop for a long time, and the highway rarely cut through any towns. It was probably 3 or 4 in the morning, and the highway was deserted. Tall pines lined the 2-lane blacktop, and jagged mountains framed the starlit sky above. Kim was sleeping heavily, her chair reclined all the way down, a blanket thrown over her head. I had the radio on, but she was so exhausted, she paid no attention to it. I was trying to concentrate on the road and the quiet music on the radio to stay awake. Visibility was very limited, and there were no lights on this road. Suddenly, red and blue lights flashed in my rearview mirror. I hastily looked at my speedometer, but I was diligently following the speed limit after the narrow escape from getting a ticket earlier. I pulled over, killed my engine, and rolled down my window. The cop car behind me appeared to be an unmarked vehicle, but it was hard to tell. Kim didn't stir as the police officer approached my window.
"Ma'am,"
he said in a Midwestern drawl.
"Do you know why I pulled you over today?"
"No, officer, I don't." His flashlight was pointed directly at my face, and I had to avert my eyes. I looked at the badge on his chest instead of his face.
"Your plates sure are from far away. Where are you headed?"
The police officer in Laramie had asked the same thing. "Georgia. Family emergency."
"Is that so? Well, miss, you aren't in any shape to make it to Georgia from Nebraska. No siree."
I frowned. Was my car breaking down? Taillights out? In my tired haze, had I missed something vital? "I'm sorry, what's wrong?"
"Here, miss, step out of the car. I can show you."
He gestured with his flashlight, and the beam slanted across Kim's blanket-shrouded face. She yawned. "What's going on?" The police officer abruptly turned, walked away, and got into his car. He flipped a U-turn and sped off in the opposite direction down the highway. Kim and I stared at each other for a moment before I started the car, rolled up the window, and sped off with no regard for the speed limit this time. I was driving in the backcountry roads of Maine with my two friends in 2012. We were on a short road trip, and it was the middle of the night. As we were driving, my friend saw something in the middle of the road. Whatever it was moving very slowly. We drove closer and stopped in front of it. It was a baby, crawling. All three of us got out of the car and ran over to it. It was a baby doll, being pulled across the street by a string. We drove away from there as fast as his car would go. My friend Thomas and I had taken a road trip down to the beach, and we were on our way back home. The sun was setting as we drove, and we were sitting silently, listening to music. Suddenly, the front passenger's side tire popped, and we pulled over. We both got out and were looking at the tire. We were talking about what we should do, who we should call, etc. When out of nowhere, we see a guy off in the distance, on the same side of the road as us, walking in our direction. By now, the sun has almost completely set, and we can't make out this guy's features very well. He seemed to come from nowhere. There were no other cars in sight anywhere, and the road we were on was pretty barren. We stood there waiting for him to approach us, thinking that we would talk to him, but instead, we got in the car and sped off when we saw that he was holding a knife.
I was 10 years old and being wheeled into the hospital late at night. I remember seeing Christmas lights decorating the front of the hospital. Once I was inside, I remember the doctor telling my parents that I had pneumonia, and my mom started to cry. Those are the only things I remember about my visit, up until I was left alone on the first night. Everyone else in the rooms around me were sleeping, and so was I, until I heard something. I was facing the center of the room when I opened my eyes. I heard someone's shoes squeaking on the floor outside my room. I turned over and saw a nurse walk by, but she had walked out of my vision, past my window before I could see her face. About 2 seconds passed, and then I saw her walk by again. This is when my heart stopped beating, because of what exactly I saw. She was walking by at a very fast pace, and was looking directly at me through my window, in an exaggerated stare, meaning she was walking by, but had her head turned completely to the right side as she did, not able to see in front of her as she walked, and just staring at me. Very quickly, she was out of sight again. Then suddenly, she started walking by again in the opposite direction. She was walking back and forth in front of my window. This time, her head turned completely to the left, again, staring into my eyes. She had brown hair that wasn't kept, and she looked insane. On this pass, I noted that her eyes were opened very wide. At this point, I thought my heart would explode because of how it was beating and how scared I was. Nobody else was in sight. When she walked out of my vision, a second later, she was walking by again. Every time, her head turned to the side, looking at me. I remember thinking, even at 10 years old, that something about her was very wrong. I didn't move a muscle and could do nothing except just watch this incredibly scary woman walk back and forth in front of my window. One of the times that she walked by, she was smiling a huge, sickening smile that made tears well up in my eyes. Every time she walked by, she could not see what was in front of her because the only thing she wanted to see was me, in my bed, through my window. It seemed like several minutes had passed until finally, she did not walk by again. She simply walked by one last time and then was gone. I sat there in bed and peered out my window expecting her to walk by again at any moment, but she didn't. I must have stared out my window for the better part of an hour before my eyes got so heavy that I fell asleep. The next morning I awoke with my dad sitting in a chair next to my bed, reading a book. He smiled when he saw I was awake, and I told him what I saw before I fell asleep. He didn't seem to be scared by this, or even very alarmed. He asked me if I was sure it wasn't a dream. I was 100% sure then, and I'm 100% sure now. The woman was real. It happened, and she was wearing the same thing as every other nurse I saw. I was in the hospital for 2 weeks, and didn't see her again. This was told to me by an ex-boyfriend of mine about 5 years ago. I don't remember his exact words, but I do remember the gist of the tale. He lied to me many times, but I wasn't dating him for his intelligence. It seemed he believed this is what happened to him. As far as what actually happened, I don't know, and I'm not going to ask him. I just wanted to know if this is something he made up, or if someone else has experienced these creatures as well. From the smell and size, I immediately thought skunk ape, but after reading about the skunk ape, I decided against it. This happened circa 1995, probably spring, and I believe it was near a suburb southeast of Orlando. He said he lived at the last house in a cul-de-sac in a predominantly Cuban neighborhood. My ex, hereafter referred to as X, said this takes place in the woods near either an abandoned airport or mall. I think airport, but I can't remember precisely. He and 2 of his friends went into the woods there one night when they were in their early teens. I dare say they had beer and were looking for a private place to drink and shenanigize. They go deeper into the woods. X smells something first. Then his friends comment on it. It smells like garbage, he says. Absolutely reeks of garbage. A blob of black sludge drops on the front of X's shirt. It stinks. It is the vile aroma they had been detecting for several minutes now. In front of him drops a very tall, around 8-foot, thin creature with red eyes. It is covered in long, fine black hair. The way it lands, he said, was the most horrifying part. It landed without a sound. It landed on its feet from branches that had to be at least 10 feet in the air. It landed without disturbing the ground, like an illusion. They ran home, but that's not the end. Being an idiot, X decided to borrow his father's pistol, which of course was not secured in any meaningful way, and returned to the woods to kill these things before they had decided to come out of the woods and cause some kind of chaos. He did not know if they were aliens or demons, but he found both conditions offensive.
He returned to the woods alone after dark. It wasn't long before he smelled the creature's stink, or before the same thing dropped down in front of him again 5 yards away. He raised the pistol and aimed to fire. The creature only stared at him. This is where I start to lose my suspension of disbelief. X suddenly feels that this thing is no threat. He lowers the pistol, and the creature takes off into the woods, and X gives chase. A quarter mile or so later, he chases the creature into a clearing where there are more of these things. There is a larger one in the center, standing with the one X was chasing. They appear to be in conversation. This larger one is more of a gray color and taller. They both look at X, and the gray one raises his long-fingered, bony hand towards the young boy. The small, black-haired one seems to say something to the gray one. X says the communication was not audible. The message is clear. It's all right. He won't hurt us. The gray-haired creature lowers his arm. At this point, outnumbered, X flees. He never went back into those woods, alone or otherwise. And that's the tale. I'm not sure if I believe it myself, but he swore it was true. I've told it to the best of my knowledge and memory, as well as refining his telling into something more readable. Has anyone else seen these things?
This happened to me 4 years ago, in 2012. I was in the hospital, and for reasons I'd rather not share. It's not interesting anyway, but what is interesting is what happened one day while I was there. I woke up early one morning, before the sun came up, to see that another girl was now sharing the room with me. She wasn't there before. She was laying in her bed and appeared to be crying. For the longest time, I didn't say anything. I eventually did speak, and when I did, I said, "Hi, are you okay?" I realized that question was a dumb one, considering she was in the hospital, crying. She responded back and said she didn't feel good. I told her I was sorry and that I didn't feel good either. I asked her what was wrong, and she didn't respond. I told her my name was Katie and asked what hers was. She replied, "Julie." She continued to cry, and I just laid there, feeling bad for her, feeling helpless. I had fallen back to sleep, and when I woke up, she was gone. Which was weird as hell, I thought. That day, I was excited, because I was leaving after having been there a few days. I laid in bed and watched TV, until my sister and my mom eventually arrived and came in with a doctor and a nurse. They asked me how I felt, and my mom and sister hugged me, and I told everyone I felt great and was ready to leave. I got up and went to the restroom to change, and when I came out, I asked the doctor about the girl that was in my room earlier that morning, and he said he didn't know who she was or that there was another girl there, but that another doctor may have moved her to my room temporarily and then back out when another room became available. I shrugged, and on my way out of the room, I walked up to the nurse's station and asked the nurse who had been helping me for the past few days where the girl was that was in my room. She told me she had passed away. I was shocked and felt so bad. I asked when. The nurse said 6 days ago, and I was confused. I told her there was another girl in my room earlier that morning and asked what the girl's name was that had died. She responded to me and said, "Julie."
My sister Sarah walks at night. She often goes outside and walks around the farm. 2 nights ago, I looked outside and saw her walking at a brisk pace, holding Father's hatchet. It wasn't the first time she has butchered our cattle. We might have sent her away if not for the truth. She is asleep when she goes walking at night. Father has been gone for 5 years, and Mother cries most of the time. She cries because of Sarah. It was 1:30 after midnight when I awoke. I know she opened my door as I shut it when I sleep. She often walks around with knives and sharp farm tools. When I walked down the stairs, I saw her. She was sitting in Father's chair, clutching a knife. She was looking at me. I took a single step towards her, and she sprung up to her feet and took 2 paces towards me, and then stopped. I said her name, Sarah, and told her I would take her back to bed. She said to me, "I am not sleeping." I then asked her if she was not asleep, then why is she holding a knife? She spoke, "Because I want to kill you and Mother." I told her she was ill and needed to put the knife back before Mother catches her. She turned around and walked outside. I didn't leave the house that night. When Mother and I found Sarah in the morning, she had stabbed herself in the eye and was dead, face down outside the barn. I'm worried about Mother. She hasn't walked at night since stabbing Father 5 years ago. She says she was asleep when she did it. My mother never sleeps. Again? Again? Those were the words I heard Daddy saying while looking down at one of the chickens. It was completely ripped open. Blood was everywhere. This had been the 4th chicken this week. I was just a boy at the time, but I remember Daddy shouting out that he would gut the beast that was eating our chickens. Daddy unraveled some wire and emptied out some cans of beans. He wired the cans around the perimeter of the coop. The beast would come, and when it hit the wire, the cans would sound. True to his plan, late that night, we heard the sound of the cans falling and clanking. The beast was outside. Daddy took the rifle, threw on his boots, and ran out there to face whatever beast was slaughtering those chickens. I watched from the window as I saw Daddy run out through the field and then stop dead. I ran outside to see what it was. When I approached, I looked at him. His mouth was open, with one lip curled in to create a face of disgust. It was no beast. It was a man. A skin and bones man with long hair and a beard, not wearing clothes. He was hunched over a chicken. He was holding the mutilated bird above his head and letting the blood drain into his mouth. I had never seen something so terrifying, not even 30 years later as I write this. Daddy lifted the rifle and yelled, "You need to leave." I don't know if it was on purpose, but Daddy shot the gun and almost hit the man. The man quickly got up and looked at my daddy. A bloody smile he gave, and then ran away. He never came back, but I wonder, why was he eating the chickens? Maybe some sort of satanic ritual. Maybe he was ill. Or maybe he just liked the taste of blood. The lady that my mother asked to watch my sisters and I was not well. She would arrive at our flat at dark while my mother was gone and watch us until she returned. She would always insist on playing hide and go seek. My sisters and I love this game, but not with the lights off. She would insist that all the lights are off. This night, it was first my turn to find them. I found my sisters first. They were downstairs hiding together under the table. The lady was hiding somewhere upstairs. I was too afraid to go look after the last visit. She came out of the darkness and grabbed me. When I screamed, she put her fingers down my throat. Me and my sisters waited in the library until Mother returned. She was very upset with the lady. She could not find her either. Mother decided that she had gone, but I was afraid she was still here. As I lay in bed, I began to fall asleep. But then I opened my eyes and she was there, standing at the edge of my bed. As I screamed, she put her fingers down my throat and my eyes poured tears.